The air inside the high tribunal chamber was thick with the scent of polished metal and sterilized stone, an artificial cleanness that made the place feel more like a mausoleum than a court of law. Seated atop an obsidian dais, the Galactic Council watched in amusement as the old man was brought forth in heavy restraints, his thin wrists bound by luminous energy cuffs. Colonel Richard Donovan did not stumble. He did not bow his head. If the chains weighed on him, he gave no indication. He walked with deliberate steps, his frame wiry beneath the coarse fabric of his prison uniform. His once imposing shoulders had curved with age. His silver hair was cropped short, and deep lines marked his face like old battle scars. He was a relic, a fossil of a lost species, paraded for judgment before a jeering audience. A voice, guttural and filled with condescension, echoed through the vast chamber. "So this is the infamous war chief of Earth," sneered Grand Arbiter Zalthun, his elongated, reptilian skull gleaming under the artificial lights. His crimson robes fanned out around his sinewy frame as he leaned forward. How utterly unremarkable! Laughter rippled through the gathered delegates. The insectoid Zrith ambassador clacked his mandibles, emitting a sharp chittering sound that might have been amusement. Even the normally stoic Azar officials, their sunken eyes devoid of warmth, exchanged smirks of contempt. Donovan exhaled through his nose, letting their amusement settle like dust. He had seen this before. Arrogance disguised as authority, smugness mistaken for supremacy. They were too comfortable in their seats of power, too assured of their own dominion. He had once fought men like this, only they had worn different uniforms. A smaller figure, humanoid yet distinctly alien, stepped forward, unfurling a scroll of shimmering data. By decree of the Unified Galactic Council, the clerk announced Colonel Richard Donovan, former military leader of the now-defunct Earth Defense Initiative, is hereby charged with crimes against sentient life, genocide, and acts of extreme aggression against the lawful forces of the Galactic Order. Donovan remained silent. His pulse did not quicken, nor did his expression shift. He had spent decades standing in war councils where men deliberated over the fates of millions. He knew when to speak and when silence carried more weight. "Do you understand these charges, human?" Zalthun's ridged lips curled, his forked tongue flicking between sharpened teeth. "Do you comprehend the extent of your sins?" Donovan tilted his head slightly, his pale blue eyes regarding the Grand Arbiter with the patience of a man who had seen too much. "I understand." His voice was hoarse but steady, edged with the gravel of old battles. Zalthun's nostrils flared. "Then do you deny them?" A pause. Donovan flexed his fingers against the restraints, feeling the faint buzz of energy against his skin. "No." A murmur of approval rippled through the chamber. The confession was taken as an admission of guilt, a final surrender from the last human warlord. A thin, serpentine smile slithered across Zalthun's lips. "At least you have the wisdom to acknowledge your crimes." Donovan's lips twitched just barely. "You misunderstand. I do not deny them, because I do not regret them." The chamber fell into stunned silence. Zalthun's fingers curled into his throne's armrests. "You dare." "I did what had to be done," Donovan interrupted, his voice calm but carrying the weight of steel. "And I would do it again." The silence twisted into something heavier, something uncertain. A flicker of discomfort passed through the gathered officials. They had expected a broken man, a weary soldier begging for mercy, not a warrior unrepentant in the face of death. A hulking Zathari enforcer, his emerald scales gleaming beneath his battle armor, took a step forward, his clawed hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial blade. "Watch your tongue, human," he growled, "or it will be removed before your execution." Donovan turned his gaze toward him, unfazed. "You're welcome to try." Zalthun's hand lifted, halting the enforcer before he could move. "Enough," he hissed. "This farce is over." He shifted his focus back to Donovan, his amusement now curdled into disdain. "For the atrocities you have committed, for the lives you have extinguished, and for the audacity to defy this council even now, you are sentenced to public execution at dawn." The insectoid's drift let out a series of please clicks. The Azar official nodded in approval. The sentence was expected, inevitable. But as the council members moved to finalize the proceedings, Donovan did something that made them pause. He smiled. It was not the grin of a man resigned to his fate. It was not the placid acceptance of the condemned. It was the kind of smile that had once sent entire enemy regiments into retreat. A smile without fear, without surrender. Zalthun narrowed his eyes. "You find this amusing?" Donovan's voice was almost a whisper, but it carried across the chamber, sending an inexplicable chill through the air. "I was just remembering something from an old war. A lesson I learned about men like you." Zalthun's jaw tightened. "And what is that?" The restraints around Donovan's wrist flickered, the energy cuffs shorting out for the briefest of moments. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air followed. A whisper of movement, the kind that only a trained soldier would notice. Donovan inhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second. When they opened, the frail old man was gone. In his place stood something else. Something older than the war, older than the stars. "The war isn't over." The silence that followed Colonel Richard Donovan's words was short-lived. A flicker of warning ran through the chamber, an unseen pulse beneath the polished stone floor. The Grand Arbiter's ridged brow creased, his forked tongue tasting something in the air. Something wrong. Then the lights flickered. For a fraction of a second, the chamber was plunged into near darkness. A whisper of static crackled through the air, so faint that only the most attuned could sense it. When the lights surged back to full brightness, Donovan was exactly where he had been, his hands still bound, his stance still casual. But something had changed. Zalthun's eyes narrowed. He signaled to the guards. "Restrain him," he ordered. "Now." The Zathari enforcer stepped forward, his scaled hand reaching for Donovan's shoulder. Before he could make contact, the human shifted. It was not a desperate lunge, nor a frantic attempt to break free. It was smooth, practiced. One moment he was standing still. The next, the enforcer's arm was wrenched at an unnatural angle. A sickening snap echoed through the chamber. The Zathari let out a strangled snarl, staggering backward, clutching his ruined limb. The other guards moved in at once, but Donovan was already in motion. Despite the chains that bound him, he maneuvered with the brutal efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime reducing enemies to corpses. The energy cuffs around his wrist flared, then failed. A surge of blue light crackled through them, shorting out with a faint hiss of burning circuitry. Donovan rotated his freed wrists, flexing his fingers as if shaking off a minor inconvenience. Zalthun lurched to his feet, his composure slipping. "Security," he roared. But no one answered. The Grand Arbiter's tongue darted nervously between his teeth. The chamber's guard should have swarmed the hall, yet none appeared. The realization came too late. This had been planned. A ripple of unease passed through the gathered officials, their expressions shifting from superiority to uncertainty. The insectoid Zrith ambassador clicked his mandibles in agitation, his multifaceted eyes darting toward the exits. Donovan exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders. "Took longer than expected," he muttered. Somewhere beyond the chamber, the first explosion detonated. It was distant but unmistakable. A deep, guttural boom that reverberated through the walls, followed by the dull tremor of the structure shuddering in response. The chamber's luminescent ceiling flickered again, this time slower, almost lazily, as though the ship itself was waking from slumber. Zalthun's clawed hand gripped the edge of his throne, his pupils constricting into razor-thin slits. "What have you done?" Donovan regarded him coolly. "Laid the groundwork." The second explosion was closer. A rhythmic pounding began to echo from the corridors outside the chamber. It was not the hurried march of responding guards, but something else, something heavier, something deliberate. The doors trembled under the force of it. One of the Azar officials, a tall figure draped in layers of crimson silk, took a step back, his sunken eyes darting between the entrances. "This is impossible," he muttered, his voice thin with disbelief. The ship's security is compromised. Donovan finished for him. 20 minutes ago. Zalthun bared his teeth. Lies. Donovan raised an eyebrow. Really? As if in answer, the doors buckled under a final, decisive impact. Metal shrieked as the reinforced barriers caved inward, their locking mechanisms reduced to molten slag. A wave of smoke rolled into the chamber, thick and acrid with the scent of scorched wiring. Through the haze, the first of them stepped in. They were human, not prisoners, not refugees, not the broken remnants of a defeated species. These men moved like soldiers because they were clad in the makeshift armor of insurgents. Their faces were hidden behind dark visors, their weapons leveled with steady hands. The Galactic Council was no longer presiding over a trial. They were the ones being hunted. Zalthun surged forward, his robes whipping behind him. "Kill them!" he shrieked. The guards who remained sprang into action, drawing energy weapons, blades, and whatever instruments of war they had at their disposal. The first shots rang out, and the chamber erupted into chaos. Donovan ducked beneath a plasma bolt, his movements smooth despite his age. One of the insurgents tossed something toward him, a firearm, compact and lethal. He caught it without hesitation, the familiar weight settling into his grip like an old friend. He did not hesitate. He did not pause to consider mercy. He simply fired. The Zathri enforcer who had tried to restrain him fell with a gaping hole in his chest, the smell of burning flesh thick in the air. The insectoid ambassador attempted to retreat, but crumpled beneath a burst of precision fire. The Azar official, still frozen in place, met his end when a single shot took him between his hollowed eyes. Zalthun was retreating, his movements frantic. "This is madness," he spat, his voice a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You are alone. Humanity is finished." Donovan advanced, stepping over the bodies with practiced ease. "You people never studied history, did you?" The Grand Arbiter reached for his personal comm, no doubt calling for reinforcements. Donovan allowed it, let him call for help. It would not come. A garbled transmission sputtered from the device, filled with static and panic shouting. The words were indistinct, but the meaning was clear. The ship was lost. Donovan leveled his weapon at Zalthun's chest. The reptilian leader's chest rose and fell, his breath ragged with exertion. "You don't have to do this," he rasped. "We can negotiate." Donovan exhaled slowly. "We already did." Zalthun's eyes widened a fraction, just before the shot rang out. His body crumpled, dark ichor pooling beneath him. The room fell silent, save for the distant echoes of battle raging elsewhere on the ship. The insurgents moved efficiently, securing the remaining exits, gathering weapons from fallen guards. One of them, a younger man with sharp features and a scar running across his jaw, approached Donovan. "We have control of the lower levels," the soldier reported. "Engineering is secured. We're initiating the next phase." Donovan nodded, lowering his weapon. "And the fleet?" A brief hesitation. "They're moving, but they're still scattered. Some cells haven't responded. They will." Donovan turned, surveying the carnage with a detached eye. "We're not just taking this ship. We're sending a message." The younger man smirked. "What kind of message?" Donovan's gaze lingered on the fallen Grand Arbiter, the lifeless expression frozen on his scaled face. "That the war," he said, his voice calm, certain, "is far from over." The rhythmic hum of the ship's failing power systems pulsed like a dying heartbeat. Dim emergency lights flickered against the polished walls, casting long, shifting shadows that danced between the fallen bodies littering the floor. The Galactic Council's flagship, once a symbol of absolute authority, now reeked of burned circuitry and the acrid scent of plasma fire. Colonel Richard Donovan stood motionless in the center of the carnage, his weathered hand tightening around his stolen rifle. Blood, thick and dark, marred the once pristine tribunal chamber, staining the golden inlays that lined the Grand Arbiter's dais. Bodies, some alien, some human, lay sprawled in unnatural positions, the aftermath of a battle that had ended in ruthless efficiency. A sharp crackle sounded in his earpiece. Sector 9 is secured. A voice reported, calm but edged with exhaustion. Engineering is ours. Reactor control is locked in. But we're running out of time. Donovan exhaled slowly. The war was always a race against time. His sharp blue eyes scanned the faces of his men, veterans, insurgents, survivors of Earth's downfall. They were breathing hard, their armor blackened by enemy fire. But they were alive. They had clawed their way through overwhelming odds, through years of despair, to stand here now, reclaiming vengeance with fire and steel. Footsteps echoed from the corridor beyond. Heavy, unhurried, calculated. The insurgents shifted their weapons toward the entryway. A hush settled over them. The kind of silence that came when soldiers knew a fight was inevitable. Donovan did not move. He had heard that cadence before in 1,000 different war zones. It was the sound of men who had no reason to fear what lay ahead. A squad of elite enforcers stepped through the doorway, their forms imposing beneath the gleaming obsidian armor of the Galactic Order's most lethal division. They moved with the efficiency of hunters, their weapons bristling with advanced plasma, cores designed to melt through enemy flesh like butter. A single figure stood at their center. Unlike the others, this one did not wear a helmet. His face was eerily human, angular and unmarked by the passage of time, save for the cold detachment in his silver-gray eyes. His uniform bore no rank, but he did not need one. The way his men surrounded him, the way they deferred to his every motion, made it clear. Commander Valen, a name spoken in hushed tones across occupied human colonies. The executioner of Earth's last resistance cells. The man who had personally orchestrated the fall of Donovan's final stronghold. For the first time since this mission began, Donovan felt something stir in his chest. Not fear, not hesitation, recognition. The younger officer studied him in return, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, devoid of anger or amusement. It was the voice of a man who saw death as nothing more than a necessary function. "I should have known they'd send you," Donovan murmured. Valen's lips curved slightly, but it was not a smile. "And I should have known you'd be arrogant enough to come here in person." His eyes flickered to the fallen bodies of the council members, then back to Donovan. "You've made a mess." Donovan gave a slow, deliberate nod. "That's what I do." The enforcers raised their weapons as one, their targeting systems locking onto their prey. The insurgents tensed, fingers hovering over triggers. The air was thick with the electric anticipation of violence, a raw, unspoken understanding between men who had spent their entire lives wading through blood and ruin. Valen did not signal the attack. He simply stepped forward, hands unclasped, as if already knowing how this would end. "You can't win this," he said. "Not this time." Donovan's grip tightened around his rifle. His gaze did not waver. That's what the Germans thought at the Ardennes. Valen's brow arched slightly, the barest flicker of curiosity. An ancient battle. "I assume you were there." Donovan let out a low breath. "I was." The tension shattered like brittle glass. The first shot came from the left, an insurgent firing a fraction of a second too soon. The enforcers reacted with ruthless precision, their advanced weaponry releasing a cascade of plasma rounds. The chamber erupted into chaos. Donovan moved before the first body hit the floor. Despite his years, despite the wear of time and war, his instincts were as sharp as they had been when he was 20. He did not hesitate. Hesitation was death. He dropped low, avoiding a searing blast that cut through the air where his head had been. A single squeeze of the trigger, and one enforcer fell. Another pivot, a well-placed shot, two more collapsed. But these were not common soldiers. They adapted, shifting formations, forcing him to move. An explosion rocked the corridor behind them. The ship was fracturing, systems overloading from the sabotage his men had set in motion. They were running out of time. Valen did not engage immediately. He watched, waiting, calculating. His men fought with relentless efficiency, pushing Donovan's insurgents back, cutting them down one by one. The rebels fought hard, but they were outmatched. Donovan saw it happening, saw the slow shift in momentum. His men were losing. He turned sharply, locking eyes with the younger officer. Valen did not hesitate this time. Their weapons came up in unison. 2 shots, nearly simultaneous. Valen's plasma bolt seared through the space where Donovan had been, barely missing his side as the old soldier twisted away. Donovan's bullet struck true, hitting Valen's shoulder, forcing him back with a sharp grunt of pain. It was not a fatal shot. It was not meant to be. Valen's hand rose to the wound, his fingers pressing against the scorched fabric of his uniform. He exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "You're still fast." Donovan's jaw tightened. "You've never seen me slow?" The battle raged around them. Plasma fire, screams, the scent of burning flesh. The ship trembled violently, warning alarms blaring through the intercom. The insurgents were being pushed back. They had minutes, maybe less, before the enforcers overwhelmed them completely. Donovan made his decision. He reached for his comm. "All units, fall back." The order was immediate, unquestioned. His men disengaged, retreating through the corridors they had bled to secure. Some did not make it. Some never would. Valen did not order pursuit. He knew why. The explosives had been set. The ship was already lost. Donovan stepped backward toward the exit, rifle still trained on his opponent. Valen stood amidst the wreckage, his silver-gray eyes unreadable. "This isn't over," the commander said quietly. Donovan let a faint smirk tug at the corner of his lips. "It never is." He turned and disappeared into the smoke, leaving behind the wreckage of the tribunal, the dead counselors, and the man who had once believed he had broken the last human warrior. The war was far from over. The corridors pulsed with warning sirens, a frantic wail swallowed by the roaring chaos of battle. Smoke curled through the ship's fractured hull, carrying the acrid scent of burning insulation and charred bodies. Sparks rained from shattered control panels, flickering against the dark stains seeping into the once pristine floors. The Galactic Council's flagship, the Echelon Prime, was dying. Colonel Richard Donovan moved like a shadow through the carnage, his movements precise despite the weight of years on his bones. His breath came steady, even as fire and ruin raged around him. Behind him, his men fell back in formation, their weapons trained on every shifting shadow, every flicker of movement in the smoke. The enemy was regrouping. They had minutes, maybe less, before the full force of the Council's elite enforcers descended upon them. A voice crackled in his earpiece. Docking bay secured, but the fleet's in disarray. Some cells never got the signal. "We've got ships standing by, but we need time." Donovan didn't break stride. "We don't have time." He reached the intersection where the maintenance corridors branched off, pausing only long enough to assess the scene. Bodies, human and alien, were strewn across the floor, some still smoldering from the last exchange of fire. The path to the escape hangar was choked with debris, a jagged mess of collapsed framework and sparking cables. Another explosion trembled through the structure. He could feel it now, deep in his gut. The Echelon Prime wouldn't hold much longer. A familiar figure stepped out from the haze. Blood darkened his left shoulder, staining the once pristine fabric of his uniform. Commander Valen. The younger officer's silver-gray eyes locked onto him, unreadable as ever. His sidearm was lowered, but not holstered. He had not come here for a simple confrontation. He had come for an ending. Donovan met his gaze, rifle still firm in his hands. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken words, of wars fought in shadows and fire. Valen exhaled slowly. "You're bleeding men, Colonel." Donovan's lips barely twitched. "So are you." Valen's fingers tightened around his weapon. "Even if you make it off this ship, you won't win. You know that." Donovan tilted his head slightly, scanning the younger officer's face. "Tell me, son, have you ever been on the losing side before?" Valen's expression did not change. "No." Donovan nodded. "Then you don't know a damn thing." A warning klaxon blared, signaling a reactor breach. The deck trembled, throwing both men slightly off balance. Smoke curled between them like restless ghosts. Valen lifted his weapon. Donovan was faster. The old soldier fired first, his shot aimed not for the heart, but for the wrist. The plasma round struck true, searing through flesh and bone. Valen's gun clattered to the floor, his breath hitching as pain rippled through him. He staggered but did not fall. Donovan closed the distance in 2 swift strides, seizing the younger man by the front of his uniform. "Lesson 1, he muttered, his voice low. "Speed kills." Then he drove his fist into Valen's gut, twisting the younger man's balance before slamming him against the smoking bulkhead. Valen gasped, his body racked with the force of the impact. Donovan did not waste time. He released his grip, letting the officer crumple to one knee. "You don't fight fair," Valen rasped, coughing. Donovan turned, already moving toward the hangar. Never had the luxury. He did not look back. The docking bay was a storm of flashing lights and whirling motion. Fighters and transport vessels were already lifting off, streaking into the void beyond. His men were moving with rapid efficiency, securing the last of their people and sealing off the hangar doors behind them. One of his officers ran up to him, breathless. "We're the last ones. The fleet's moving into position. The Echelon Prime is coming apart." Donovan nodded, striding up the boarding ramp of the waiting ship. The engines were already primed, the thrusters thrumming beneath his boots. He barely made it inside before the doors sealed shut, cutting off the howling void outside. Through the viewport, the Galactic Council's once mighty flagship loomed like a wounded beast, flames licking hungrily at its exposed framework. Escaped pods jettisoned from its flanks, scattered fragments of a broken empire. As the ship lifted off, Donovan allowed himself a single breath. The war was not over. Far from it. But for the first time in a long, long while, it had begun again. As Donovan watched the Echelon Prime crumble, his fingers tightened around the armrest of his seat. The ship's destruction was a symbol, a warning sent across the vast reaches of the galaxy. The Council had laughed at him, mocked his frailty, believing they had conquered the last warrior of a dying world. They had been wrong. The comm channel crackled to life, voices overlapping in a flood of urgent transmissions. Across the fleet, human vessels, once scattered, leaderless, were rallying. Donovan's signal had reached them. A spark had been reignited in the remnants of humanity, a fury tempered by years of oppression, waiting only for the right moment to be unleashed. A younger soldier approached from the side, his dark eyes filled with the unsteady fire of someone who had survived too much too soon. "Sir," he said, his voice hesitant. "What now?" Donovan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the growing armada forming on the ship's radar. Pockets of survivors, rebel cells, stolen warships answering the call. It wasn't an army yet, but it would be. The old soldier ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, a ghost of a smirk playing at the edge of his lips. He had been here before, different enemies, different wars, but the song of battle remained the same. He leaned forward, pressing the comm button, the signal that would unleash the next war. "We go to war," he said simply, the weight of history behind the words. Outside, the void came alive. Warships emerged from the darkness, human engines roaring defiance into the stars. The Galactic Council had declared Earth finished, but Donovan was still breathing, and as long as he was breathing, the war would never end.